Donkey Kong Country is one of the best video game trilogies in human history. Don't at me. Everybody loves Donkey Kong Country 1. Everybody loves Donkey Kong Country 2. Everybody loves Donkey Kong Country 3. I can't say that with a straight face. Donkey Kong Country 3, look. It wasn't the first or second born child that got all the attention and praise from mom and dad. No, it was the youngest child where mommy and daddy simply stopped trying. And I mean this all from a fan's perspective here, because according to general reception, Donkey Kong Country 3, released by Rare on November 1st, 1996 for the SNES, does not deserve a single ounce of our love. Everybody always talks about how amazing the first two DKCs are, right? I mean, God, nobody ever shuts up about them. Donkey Kong Country 1 did a thorough job of establishing the series with its emphasis on jungle themes and capturing your imagination with the oohs and ahs that come along with exploring this massive island comprised of silicon pre-rendered graphics. I absolutely love how vehemently this game fleshes out its jungle theme, giving you levels where you swing from vines, levels where you explore humongous caves, where you cross an icy tundra. Donkey Kong Country 1 gets a 10 out of 10 when it comes to absolute immersion in the jungle setting. It's also very low stakes when it comes to plot. Donkey Kong comes home one day to find his entire stash of bananas stolen. Honestly, good for him, cause give it a couple of days and most of those bananas would have been way too ripe to eat. It would have been all mushy and gross, ugh. But Donkey decides to set out to take them back. The overall platforming here is solid, really solid for the first game in a series. Although you can tell there's still plenty of room for the formula to grow in future projects. Perhaps, say, a sequel? Donkey Kong Country 2, pretty much the greatest sequel in gaming history. It took everything the first game did and just did it so much better. More levels, more characters, more collectibles, more complex platforming, more variety in level design, higher stakes in the game's central plot. Donkey Kong Country 2 is undeniable, and there's a reason nobody shuts up about it. But therein lies the problem. Because when Donkey Kong Country 3 came out, and let me check my notes here, no, it didn't receive any bad reviews, no, it isn't overtly glitchy or unplayable in any way, no, it doesn't look worse than the previous titles graphically. If anything, it actually looks the best of the three games. But when DKC3 came out, it didn't get that same kind of praise despite its positive reception from critics. There seemed to be no overwhelming fanfare surrounding the game this time. No general acceptance that this was a classic like the other two games were. Donkey Kong Country 3 was just kinda there. And after nearly 30 years of existence, Donkey Kong Country 3 still just kinda exists. It's a game that I see not a single soul talking about, at least in a positive way, online. It's a game that the majority of Donkey Kong fans seem to outright ignore in favor of the first two games. But why is that? Was it because the game was released towards the end of the SNES's life cycle, when everybody was just too focused on getting friggin' hype over the Nintendo 64? Was it because the game's soundtrack this time wasn't composed by David Wise, the man who created the soundtrack to the first two games, you know, giving them their signature iconic sound that contributed to their glorious rise? Was it because Donkey Kong Country 2 was just so damn perfect in every way that there was no possible way a third game could live up to standards that high? Was it because, rather than giving us two iconic Donkey Kong characters, like maybe Donkey or Diddy, I don't know, they gave us Dixie Kong from DKC2 and a baby? A baby we had never even heard of up to this point and had no reason to care about because he is a baby. At the end of the day, history has flat out ignored Donkey Kong Country 3. It has put the game in a box, taped it up, placed it in a dark closet somewhere where it will just gather dust and be forgotten by everybody forever. Just to prove my point, let's take a look at what Reddit has to say about this game. Just beat Donkey Kong Country 3. Wow, this game was not good. The music is horrendous, the levels are okay for the most part, and the challenge the series is known for is mostly absent. DKC3 feels like a half-assed game, through and through. Am I the only one who doesn't like Donkey Kong Country 3? I've tried many times to play through DKC3. It doesn't feel anything like the other two games in the series to me. Something about the third game does feel off to me. The first two games feel cohesive, but I don't really like the open world map or music choices on the third. Metacritic score of 60 out of 100, one thumb up, pass instead of a smash, and a kill of... okay, this guy just went on to write like a 4,000 word critique of Donkey Kong Country 3, and I'm not about to read this. Yeah, so as you can see, Donkey Kong Country 3 is not the most popular kid in school. Its reputation isn't quite up to snuff, at least comparatively to the previous Donkey Kong Country games. Now, does that make it a bad game in any way? Does that make it inferior to the previous games in any way? No. Well, yes, but actually no. Donkey Kong Country 3 is a good game, and sometimes it's a great game, much in the way the first two titles are. And in a lot of ways, it still follows the same blueprint that made those games amazing too. You play as two different monkeys, with each one having their own personalities and set of moves that they bring to the table, thus establishing a pseudo-team-based mechanic that plays directly into how you navigate the game's platforming sections. Dixie Kong is smaller and more nimble and can twirl her hair in midair, allowing for you to cross large gaps and approach platforming sections with much more accuracy. Kiddy Kong, who is the name of the aforementioned baby you play as, is bigger and stronger, so he can deal with larger enemies easily and can throw things with more force and accuracy. You take these Kongs through various levels, and much like the previous games, the levels are each designed with immersion as their focal point. You could be running through a snowy tundra, you could be climbing vines in a wooded forest area, you could be swimming at the bottom of a lake. Whatever it is, wherever it may be, this game will make sure you not only know where you are, but you will feel like you're actually there too. And it's been said time and time again, but just look at these graphics. Look at the amount of color here. These visuals are so impressive for their time, and they're a big reason why the Donkey Kong Country series is so classic. Because they just bring a look and feel to the game that you simply can't find in any other series. A look that doubles as pseudo-realism, but also completely retro at the same time. The platforming challenges this time around are going to be mainly gimmick-based, with each level hosting its own unique level mechanic that will serve as a ground floor in which the level's design will be based around. I especially enjoy the low-gravity gimmick in Low G Labyrinth, as it comes at a time in the game where you think there's no more surprises, you're convinced you've seen everything this game has to throw at you, and then it just turns around and hits you with this level out of nowhere. It's a cool, fun time, it's completely out of left field in the best possible way, and it speaks to the overall creativity found in much of the game's level design. Fish Food Frenzy is an underwater level that has you keeping a ferocious piranha from unaliving you by feeding him red and green fish while avoiding feeding him poison sea urchins. Kong Fuse Cliffs is a level that has you climbing a burning rope while the rope gets shorter and shorter behind you, forcing you to move along at a consistent but quick pace while dodging enemies and obstacles along the way. These are just a few examples of the oozing creativity that flows from many of Donkey Kong Country 3's level design choices. The game's soundtrack is overall very solid, although it admittedly doesn't quite reach the heights of the previous games, but still does the job in helping to immerse you in the unique setting of each of these levels. There's unfortunately not going to be any standout melodies like a Sticker Brush Symphony per se that will stick in your ear after you turn the game off. As Donkey Kong Country 3's soundtrack generally feels like it's less concerned with creating spectacle-heavy pieces that take you on a journey through many highs and lows, and more concerned with creating pieces that serve the solitary purpose of acting as backdrop for the game's levels. As a result, each of the game's tracks, while adequately serving their purpose and establishing a specific mood for each level, do not stand out as musical numbers that can be enjoyed on their own outside the base game. Take the background track found in the level Ripsaw Rage, for example. While this track does a good job of establishing that there is a certain imminent danger lurking in the giant saw blade that follows you throughout the level, the track itself doesn't really build to any greater tension outside the small amount it establishes in its opening seconds. The track does pick up around the 15-second mark a tiny bit, but beyond that, it's a very quiet track that never really bothers to build to any noteworthy crescendo in its midsection. It just maintains the same quiet, slightly unsettling tone throughout, and never really goes beyond that. With Donkey Kong Country 3, you've also got a completely refined collectible system, one that actually bothers to keep things organized for you. Whereas the previous games would just have a random number of hidden bonus rooms strewn about each level for you to find, they never bothered to tell you how many there were per level, and the only way you knew whether or not you found all the challenges in a single level was through a little exclamation point that appeared at the end of each level's title in the overworld screen. There could be anywhere from 1 to 5 bonus challenges in a single level, and you wouldn't know whether or not you found them all unless that little exclamation point appeared. Luckily, in Donkey Kong Country 3, they streamlined the process by allotting a strict amount of 2 bonus challenges per level, one for you to find before the level checkpoint and one for after, and of course letting you know when you found them all through that now iconic exclamation mark at the overworld screen. This greatly expedites the collection process, making 100% completion a much more enticing opportunity for players. And on that note, you have a new collectible in the Banana Bird. Banana Birds can be found by completing fetch quests for the Brothers Bear family, whom you meet members of throughout the adventure, and by finding hidden passageways spread across the overworld, an overworld that you can freely travel across by boat. Yes, I said that right, Donkey Kong Country 3 actually has an open world. One that doesn't just have you travel between levels via a set linear path, but one that just gives you the reins to freely travel anywhere and everywhere around the Northern Hemisphere. This also has the added benefit of not forcing you to stay in a specific area until you've beaten it, which is what the previous games did, making it so you can leave to go save your progress with Wrinkly Kong whenever you need to. These small quality of life features alone already make Donkey Kong Country 3 the most accessible and arguably mature game in the series. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate how Donkey Kong Country 2 would make you beat a handful of its levels first before allowing you access to a save point, but it's just nice not having to deal with the unneeded punishment of having to replay a few levels if I ever ran out of lives and had to restart from an old save. Trust me, I do not miss that. It also does away with the completely stupid mechanic that is Funky's Flights. Funky's Flights is a feature exclusive to DKC's 1 and 2, where after beating every few levels, you would have access to one of Funky's airplanes that would allow you to fly to any point in the game, even to other worlds if you wanted. The problem with this feature is that this is the only way you can have access to other levels outside the world you are already currently traveling through. Otherwise, the game simply doesn't allow you to leave the current world you're in until you find a Funky's Flight spot, making it far more of a chore when accessing save points, as well as limiting your freedom to backtrack to any previous levels you may not have fully completed, and generally just making overworld navigation far less flexible and much more archaic. Donkey Kong Country 3 gets it right by allowing you full access to every world you discovered up to that point via boat travel, which, as silly an idea as 2 young monkeys who don't know the first thing about operating a piece of mechanical transportation may seem, it gets the job done of making DKC3 a more enjoyable game to complete by making backtracking a much more natural experience. After all, there are plenty of reasons why you'd want to backtrack in Donkey Kong Country 3, and they aren't just for the collectibles. As previously mentioned, Donkey Kong Country 3's levels are centered around immersion, making you really feel like you're there, running through each of these immaculately themed spaces. But not only are they immersive, they are also all around just creative, comparatively to the first 2 games. Whereas the first game's levels took the idea of a desolate jungle island and fleshed that out to the point of exhaustion, Donkey Kong Country 2's levels were far more varied, all over the place, and less cohesive thematically. Donkey Kong Country 3 takes both of these ideas and combines them to create a set of levels that thematically feel fresh but familiar. You've definitely got your basic forest settings and underground caves that feel emblematic of DKC1's level themes, but DKC3 adds its own artistic twist in order to make these levels stand out on their own. Whereas the level Barrel Shield Bust Up feels extremely derivative of the wooded forest level themes of Vine Valley in DKC1, DKC3 adds its own twist to that concept by incorporating a brighter color palette to the level design, and making it so you're navigating through tall trees that tower over the entire forest rather than simply having you navigate on ground paths. Whereas many of the underwater levels in DKC3 may air too similarly to something like a Coral Capers from DKC1, again, it makes the whole situation feel new by just adding way more color as well as variety to the visuals here. I doubt you would have expected seeing all this underneath some lake in the middle of the Northern Hemisphere, and that's what Donkey Kong Country 3 does best with its artistic design. It takes familiar concepts from previous games and makes them unfamiliar. Instead of just having you enter a blizzardy, snowy tundra where you can barely see 3 feet in front of you, DKC3 has you traveling an almost calm, peaceful mountain village, completely antithetical to what we've seen previously. I personally just love the way everything in this game looks, as I think it did a much better job of highlighting the SNES's graphical capabilities than the previous games did. Donkey Kong Countries 1 and 2 had a darker, dingier vibe graphically that made the final product look good overall, but it also made it feel less detailed. Donkey Kong Country 3's bright colors make for a more stimulating, vibrant look, with more finer details popping out at the player, further highlighting the amazingness that is these pre-rendered graphics. So heckin' beautiful. Man, this is good. So, we know that Donkey Kong Country is a good game. We figured that out. It's a solid game, it's fun. So, obviously, there's no reason for us to dig any deeper. There's no reason for us to nitpick, to dig up details of the game that we don't like, put it on display, talk about it, rant about it, and inevitably end up pissing off thousands of people, right? We don't need to do that, right? This isn't that type of video! This is Donkey Kong Country 3 deserves better. Or does it? That's why I put that at the end of the title there. Or does it? That's important. Because it's not that simple with me. You know what we gotta do? We gotta dissect Donkey Kong Country 3. We gotta dissect Donkey Kong Country 3. We gotta figure out what's wrong with it. And we need to figure out why people don't like it as much. Guess what? I think that I have figured out why people don't like Donkey Kong Country 3. And I boiled it down to a specific moment in game. That is the sole reason why people do not like this game. And here it is. Let's look at it this way. If you were the third game in a series, and your job was to follow up 2 flawless masterpieces like DKC's 1 and 2, you had better be bringing something special to the table. And that's the kind of bad situation DKC3 found itself in upon release. Because how could you possibly hope to top something like Donkey Kong Country 2? Was that even possible at this point in time? Well, let's draw some comparisons to see how well they tried. Donkey Kong Country 2's storyline begins on the very ship where the first game ended. As you play as Dixie and Diddy, you discover a note left behind by King K. Rool himself, letting you know he has kidnapped Donkey Kong. And now you have to go on this epic hero's journey in order to not only save Diddy's best friend, but also so Diddy can find his confidence and come of age as his own ape. Following that, the player begins level 1 of the game already behind enemy lines, already kicking the hornet's nest as he and Dixie blast their way through hordes of Kremlings across this massive enemy ship. This is an absolutely epic way to begin the game. It sets the stakes super high and establishes a blisteringly adventurous tone for the rest of the game. It lets you know right away that this isn't going to be some slapstick, low-stakes trek to get your banana horde back like the first game. This adventure is going to be serious. It's going to be epic. It's going to be fun. It's going to be hard. There's going to be ups. There's going to be downs. It's going to change you as a person. You're not going to be the same monkey after all is said and done, but it's going to be worth it. And it's going to provide a lot of life lessons along the way. That's the kind of adventure Donkey Kong Country 2 sets you up for right at level 1. That is the tone that Donkey Kong Country 2 sets for the rest of the game. So, what does Donkey Kong Country 3 do to set up its adventure? Well, if you have the instruction booklet for the game, you'll find out that in this adventure, both Donkey and Diddy have gone missing, and the only thing they left behind was a note that says they've gone exploring and they'll be back later. Dixie Kong, being the bright, young, well-educated monkey that she is, immediately suspects another kidnapping by King K. Rool here, so she decides to set out on her own adventure to uncover the mystery of where her missing friends are. And there you have it, Donkey Kong Country 3's entire storyline laid out for you in the game's instruction booklet. There's plenty of information here to set you up for the whole game, and I appreciate how thorough this explanation is, but what if you don't have the instruction booklet to go off of? Well, then you would just boot up the game, and it begins with Dixie Kong jumping off a cliff into a lake, She crosses the lake and makes it to dry land, where there is a cave in front of her called Wrinkly's Save Cave. Naturally, the first thing the player would do is enter the cave, where Wrinkly Kong is there to explain to you how the save system works. Okay. She talks for a bit, and then you leave. You find upon leaving that to the left of the cave is a lone wooden shack. You wonder what could be in that shack. Maybe it's the first actual level of the game. So naturally, you enter the shack, where you are then introduced to Bazaar, the bear who owns the shop, and he explains to you how there are a bunch of other bears who run storefronts throughout the overworld that you can find for some extra side quests. He goes on and on about this for way too long, and at this point the player is likely getting anxious to start the actual game. But nope. After you leave Bazaar's shop, you then have to travel over to Funky's Rentals, where another wall of text cutscene ensues, as Funky explains to you the boat upgrade system, and after that, provides the worst, most half-assed introduction to a new main character in any video game ever, as he introduces you to Kiddy Kong. And when I say half-assed, I mean it. The way Funky introduces him to Dixie and the way Kiddy just kinda sits there plopped on his ass with that confused look on his face makes this whole situation feel like Funky is just pawning off this long-standing nuisance in his life for someone else to deal with. Once you are finally done with your third consecutive long-winded cutscene, you then get in a boat that Funky lets you borrow and you travel over to the first official world of the entire game, Lake Orangatanga, where you can finally enter the first stage of the friggin' game and actually start playing the thing. Thank goodness. And since this is the first level of the whole game, you imagine that the devs would want to put their best foot forward here, as this is the level that will set the tone for the rest of the game. I mean, sure, the first few opening cutscenes didn't do this game any favors in terms of pacing, but as long as they come through with a cool, exciting opening level that'll actually get me hyped to play the rest of the game, we're all good here. Donkey Kong Country 3 opens with Lakeside Limbo, a very basic, bare-bones, run-of-the-mill, forgettable level that, to its credit, does its job of teaching you the basics, but does virtually nothing beyond that for the player. It does nothing to set any stakes, it does nothing to create excitement. It feels like the whole level is just you enjoying a nice, relaxing weekend up at the cabin. But the problem here is that that feels completely out of place in this context. Why would you open the game with a nice, peaceful, relaxing trip up to the family cabin while your two best friends have gone missing and you urgently need to go find them? It basically sends the message to the player that plot isn't at all important here and there's no urgency or reason that we should care about it. This is Donkey Kong Country 3. You're not here for the story, you're here for the silicon pre-rendered graphics and awesome platforming. Okay, that's fair, but how can you make that kind of argument when your opening level's platforming is the literal antithesis of excitement? The platforming is dull, underdeveloped, and devoid of any effort or passion. It truly does nothing to entice me to play any further. If anything, all it does is motivate me to go play DKC2 instead, because at least that game bothers to invest you in its content. It actually provided you with a physical note from King K. Rool in-game that you can find, letting you know about the high-stakes adventure you're about to go on, and then follows that up with an expertly crafted first level that gets you not only invested in the plot, but the actual gameplay as well. But DKC3, it relegates the same plot device in the note to the instruction booklet, feeds you 3 information dump cutscenes in a row, and after 5 minutes sends you on your way to one of the most half-baked DKC levels ever. And that right there caps off the entire introduction to Donkey Kong Country 3. An introduction that up to this point has done nothing to get the player invested in what's going on, it's done nothing to get them excited, it is an all-around flat, weak, undercooked intro that completely botches itself at every turn. That right there is the most likely reason why people don't like this game. Okay, so we figured it out then. We figured out that while Donkey Kong Country 3 is a solid enough platformer on its own right, as a Donkey Kong Country game, it did a really bad job at creating a good first impression on the player. And as we know at Donkey Kong Country games, first impressions are everything. Would we have felt the same way about Donkey Kong Country 2 had they had us playing as Diddy on the main island, aimlessly walking around talking to other Kongs trying to figure out where his best pal Donkey is? Absolutely not. The reason we love that game so much is because of the memories that we shared when we first booted it up and played the first level Pirate Panic, and how those feelings that we felt in the beginning stuck with us through the rest of the game and actually evolved, creating the very love and very attachment that we have to Donkey Kong Country 2. That is the impeccable first impression that that game created on us. As far as Donkey Kong Country 3's first impression goes, the first hour of the game, honestly, left me feeling nothing. I'm not sure if this situation is due to the devs resting a bit too much on their laurels and simply not trying as hard on this game's opening minutes due to the simple fact that, hey, it's a Donkey Kong Country game, people will play it regardless, but they really fumbled the bag with this intro. And it makes the situation even worse once you realize that not only are the opening 10 minutes of this game bad, but honestly, it doesn't get much better until you reach about the second world in. After beating Lakeside Limbo, if you haven't already given up on the game by this point, you enter the second level of the first world, Doorstop Dash. And this level? Well, all it does is make everything so much worse. You find the Kongs in this dank, ugly-looking shack where the main mechanic of the level is to hang from various switches in order to pull open nearby doors. First of all, this level mechanic is really dumb, and further emphasizes the lack of creativity found throughout the game's opening minutes. And two, this entire level is just ugly and unenjoyable to exist within. I mean, who wants to be hanging around in an abandoned shack pulling on switches for the next few minutes? Nobody. And the soundtrack doesn't do this level any favors either. Well, I mean, it does in the sense that it contributes to the level's outright boring atmosphere, but that doesn't exactly help the player enjoy being here any more than they likely are up to this point. Titled Trouble, the third level in, is basically a reskinned copy of Lakeside Limbo, with its platforming sections again being super uninspired, and its only saving grace being that you get to play as On Guard. But even his sections are extremely basic, with you really just holding right to win the whole way through as you blast the enemy fish set in front of you. I would complain about how lame of a way this is to reintroduce a popular character into your game, but then I remembered half-assed character introductions are kind of this game's thing, so I say nothing. Skidda's Row is the first snow and ice themed level in-game, and as usual it is just as boring and basic as the previous levels. Oh, and next you have Murky Mill, which is the cherry on top of everything, because once again we find ourselves going back to that ugly looking shack vibes of Doorstop Dash, but this time everything is darker and more melancholic, and you get the privilege of playing as a brand new animal buddy for the first time, Ellie the Elephant. Ellie is very similar to Rambi the Rhino in that she charges forward with a lot of force and can take out larger enemies pretty easily. She can also shoot water from her trunk at enemies, giving her the ability to do damage at a range. But you want to know the main thing she has going for her above all else? She is deathly terrified of rats. If you approach a rat at a close enough distance while playing as Ellie, she will automatically drop all that she is doing and run screeching the opposite direction. And the player has zero control over all of this. And you want to know what there's a lot of in the level Murky Mill? Yeah, this entire level is basically you playing as Ellie, running forward until you see a rat, shooting a barrel at the rat from a distance, and trudging on. Sometimes you'll come across a rat, but there will be no barrels nearby, so you have to backtrack to a previous area where a barrel is present, pick it up, and bring it all the way back to the area you were just in to get rid of these damn rats. I don't think I need to explain how annoying something like this is to the player. Murky Mill is easily the worst level in this entire game, and possibly the entire series, bar none. And finally, you have the first boss level, Belcha's Barn, which has you fighting a giant barrel with teeth. Yeah, I literally cannot remember any of the specifics of this fight as I'm writing this right now, and honestly, I think that perfectly describes the fight itself, so I don't think I need to go any further with it. That right there was a fully accurate depiction of my experience playing Donkey Kong Country 3's first hour. It wasn't good. It was really bad, actually. And where it does nothing to make you want to stick around and enjoy more of the game's content, explore a little bit, it does everything to run you off and make you never want to touch this piece ever again. But if you are one of the lucky, tenacious few who, after wasting an hour of your life with the most mid-tastic gameplay ever, actually keep playing the game after that, you will discover that after the game's first hour or so, after you complete the first world, the game actually starts getting good. Once again, I have no idea what exactly happened during the development cycle to cause this game to randomly start getting good around its second world, but hey, that's exactly what happened here. Because all those positive things I listed off towards the beginning of the video about the game, yeah, that all starts to shine through in the Kremwood Forest onward, where this actually starts to feel like a semblance of a Donkey Kong Country experience. The game just suddenly becomes good old-fashioned platforming fun, and even though its best moments definitely don't quite reach the heights of Donkey Kong Country 2, there's still a lot of good to be found here. It's likely the devs knew this game was never going to be able to match Donkey Kong Country 2, so they smartly opted to take a bold new direction with everything. That includes the music, enemy and level design, boss fights, all of it. All of it just feels a little off kilter from the previous games, but not necessarily in a bad way. The enemies this time aren't going to be your basic green Kremlings or yellow zingers that you see all the time. Instead, you might have purple Kremlings with these long stringy hands. How weird is that? Or you could have orange Kremlings who stick their tongues out and hop up and down like a cartoon. What is even happening? Or you might have this guy. Jesus Christ, look at him. Holy shit. He's ripped. God, dude is double beefed up. Damn. In general, Donkey Kong Country 3 doesn't opt to build on what the first two games set up, but instead, it chooses to carve its own path. And this is something you will continue to see in the brighter color palette, the less ambient but more industrial soundtrack, the new animal buddies, the new Kongs, the fresh boss fights, the new overworld, the gimmick-focused levels. It all adds up to serve its main purpose of just being different. Donkey Kong Country 3 strives to be different from its predecessors, but by doing so, it ends up sacrificing a lot of what made the previous games special. The main thing Donkey Kong Country 3 is missing, in my opinion, is that wow factor. It's all in all just a low energy, low stakes, chill, lacking in any real spectacle or energy, lacking in any memorable moments type experience. It's definitely a Donkey Kong Country game at its core, but it feels like a lazier version of previous games. The main storyline provides absolutely no urgency or stakes to the player, and honestly just feels like it was made to give the Kongs something to do. The music is just that, music, and feels like it was literally made to act as simple backdrop for this game and nothing more. The fresh level themes serve their purpose of being new and different, but they also in hindsight don't hold any thematic significance to the Donkey Kong Country series in the same way that the underground cave levels in DKC1 or the pirate ship levels in DKC2 did. The way they opted to use the series' antagonist, King K. Rool, is even further reflective of how not Donkey Kong Country this game is at times. Rather than having King K. Rool raise the stakes by devising this ultimate master plan that trumps all master plans so he can finally defeat the Kongs in the third game of this trilogy, he instead gets relegated to hanging out in a small booth for the entire game, and he only shows up briefly at the end just before the final boss fight to reveal he's been controlling this massive, ugly-looking robot the entire time. Oh, and he also kidnapped Donkey and Diddy. Almost forgot about that part. You see the problem here. This doesn't feel like the third game in a classic series. While the game itself is good, simply being a good game isn't enough, especially if said game is supposed to be acting as the grand finale to a classic trilogy of games. Donkey Kong Country 3 is the third game in the Donkey Kong Country series, and yet, it doesn't feel at all like this epic finale it should be. It feels like a lethargic whimper. It feels like the devs were faced with insurmountable expectations when creating Donkey Kong Country 3, and rather than face those expectations head on and create an appropriate third act send-off that could have maybe, just maybe, blown Donkey Kong Country 2 out of the water, they opted to walk away from that kind of pressure and instead create a slightly phoned-in product that to this day exists in most people's minds as a very good to great platformer first, and a classic Donkey Kong Country game second. So as a simple video game, does Donkey Kong Country 3 deserve better? Absolutely. I think the gameplay is extremely solid, and people give it a hard time because it's not quite up to snuff with the previous games, and I agree, it isn't quite on the level of the previous games, at least gameplay-wise, but by itself, it's still a good time, and it's not glitchy, and it's overall just good, solid fun. Now, as a Donkey Kong Country game, does it deserve better? I do not think so. I think that Donkey Kong Country 3 is lacking a certain X factor that Donkey Kong Countries 1 and 2 have, that it just simply does not bring to the table. There's a certain energy that the previous games bring that Donkey Kong Country 3 is just lacking in every way. It's a lethargic, lazy, chill experience, and while there's nothing wrong with that, when you're talking about Donkey Kong Country here, there is everything wrong with that. But yeah, guys, that's my overall take on Donkey Kong Country 3. Fun game, but not the best Donkey Kong Country game in the world. Donkey Kong Country is a great series, and I kind of want to go play more of it after all this talking about it. So I might go do that. If you guys liked the video, please be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, like, do whatever you got to do. Whatever YouTube wants you to do, just do it, please. Thanks for watching, everybody. You'll be seeing me soon.